poker game fueled by whiskey explodes in gunfire outside a frontier saloon. A wounded cowboy falls from his horse, his foot hung up in a stirrup, while his two buddies open fire on the gambler who shot him. Panicked horses scream and rear at the shooting, desperate to get away. It's all captured in oil on canvas in smoke of a .45. Another action-packed painting of the Old West from the brush of the legendary cowboy artist, Charlie Russell. And today, you can stand exactly where that painting was created, in Russell's restored historic log cabin studio in Great Falls, Montana.
If you've ever seen a picture of Charlie's studio, maybe with Charlie standing in his studio, when you walk into the studio now, you'll feel like you're walking into one of those photographs.
Many consider Charles M. Russell the greatest Western artist of all time. His paintings and other works capture every aspect of the Old West, Native Americans, cowboys, and Western wildlife, much of which he saw firsthand.
Russell wanted to experience that West, the real West, before it was gone, and he did that. And he painted what he saw, what he felt, what he experienced.
Obsessed with the Wild West, Russell's parents let 16-year-old Charlie leave his affluent St. Louis home for Montana in 1880, where he found work wrangling horses for the big cattle outfits on the open range. Russell would cowboy for more than 10 years, experiencing firsthand a life that would soon vanish forever. And all the while, the self-taught artist was sketching, drawing, and molding clay like he'd always done, both remembering and imagining the dramatic Western scenes he would later recreate in oil, watercolor, and bronze.
Russell really created the scenes that we remember today as a culture as the American West. The West that we think about when we think about the West is the West that Charlie Russell painted.
The artist also spent significant time with Indians, with whom he had always sympathized and painted more than any other subject.
His Native American portraits are thought to be quite authentic, and so he has a strong following among Native American communities who see him as an artist who portrayed their culture more realistically than other artists did, especially with the Blackfeet, because he knew them well, spent time living with them, understood their culture. He understood sign language, a great painting fireboat, for example. One of the warriors in that scene is making the sign for fireboat, which is steamboat, coming up the Missouri River. So there's a whole level of communication in the paintings that, unless you read sign language, you miss it altogether.
And most of that treasured work was created in the log cabin studio he built in 1903, just steps from the home he shared with his wife, Nancy. When we first visited the C.M. Russell Museum, you could only see Charlie's studio from a relatively small viewing area through a wall of plexiglass, an arrangement that had been in place for decades. Still, patrons at the time certainly enjoyed their visit.
Like I said, I can envision somebody like Russell with one of his friends like Johnny Matheson, who was one of his old compatriots. Matheson was so used to being outside that he never got used to the idea of going to an indoor bathroom. Going into the house, and Matheson wants to go to the bathroom, and Charlie says, well, I'll take you upstairs, and he said, I'll take you to the bathroom, and Matheson says, I took a bath 2 months ago. He says, I need to go now. He says, where's the barn? So eventually he had to take him outside somewhere. Unfortunately, Nancy wasn't here at the time, or so the story goes. So.
Totally changed from what someone may have experienced if they visited the museum previously.
But now the museum has completed a $1 million renovation and reinterpretation of both the studio and the Russell home.
If Charlie was just sitting here painting, that's what that photograph showed. And so
instead of looking through glass, you can step into the actual studio and into the world where Charlie lived and worked a century ago.
That's one of the fun things about this studio. You can look at these old historic photographs and then look at the wall and say, oh yeah, I see it now. I can see the birch backrest, and it's over in that corner.
The cabin was filled with mementos and artifacts from the world he'd lived in, as both a friend of the Indian and a working cowboy. Beaded gloves, Indian leggings, and a war shirt are among the items hanging from the cabin walls. And there's a red sash like the one Charlie usually wore around his waist. An easel displays an unfinished painting with tubes of paint and a brush on a nearby pallet.
We don't want people touching things, but we also want people to be able to walk over and look at this desk and say, oh look, this is a letter Charlie was writing to Joe DeYoung. I wonder what he had to say. He's talking about how to draw a horse I wonder if there's maybe a model of a horse. Oh yeah, I bet Charlie made that model up there, and maybe he was looking at that model when he was writing this letter. That's what we want people to be able to do.
It all looks as if Charlie has just stepped out for a moment, except that everything you now see is a historic recreation.
You know, people are sad that it's no longer Charlie's real artifacts, but it wasn't sustainable. Those artifacts, when we moved them, some of them were so fragile, they broke when we moved them.
Charlie's real memorabilia was on display in the studio when visitors stood behind the glass wall, but it wasn't an ideal situation.
It just wasn't a very interactive or immersive experience.
Yet while the items might not be Charlie's originals, the studio certainly feels authentic as you explore the big room where the master created his art and took time out to visit with his old cowboy buddies, known as the Bunch. Russell often included his friends in his paintings, many came to know during his years horseback in the 1880s.
And anyone who'd been to Montana and seen the regions where he was painting would quickly realize that there was something to this, that it had a real feel to it, a feel of authenticity that other artists couldn't capture.
But we'd probably never know of Charlie if not for Nancy.
Very true.
Before she came along, the talented artist often gave his work away or traded it for drinks. But everything changed when he met Nancy Cooper in 1895. Married the following year, the 18-year-old Mrs. Russell became Charlie's business manager, negotiating the exhibits, commissions, and sales of his work that brought Charlie fame and an income worthy of his talent.
She was the one who negotiated all the calendar deals and things like that. So when you go in the home, you'll really get a sense of what Charlie and Nancy's home life might have looked like and what Nancy's role was.
Today, when you step inside the home the couple built in 1900, a recreation of Nancy's desk is the first thing you see. And you can read the actual letters she typed and sent to prospective buyers and exhibitors.
So this is July 8th, 1919, and she's talking about her visit to Calgary.
While the studio was clearly Charlie's man cave, Nancy was in charge of the house. Newly refurbished and reimagined by the museum, the house is furnished and decorated to look as it would have in the early 1900s.
We took it back to as close as we could get it to when Charlie and Nancy lived there.
Meticulous researchers tracked down and recreated the home's original red-flowered wallpaper.
So this display is fun. It shows the restoration of the house. And so when we were peeling back the wallpaper, we had to go through all of these layers. And so we have pictures of what all the layers looked like until we got back to the original. So you can still see the holes. And
Christina points out the marks where curtains hung to block off a downstairs living room, a corner of which served as Charlie's studio from 1900 until the cabin studio was built in 1903.
That's where he painted. And he would set up these little dioramas of a teepee or one of his little sculptures of a horse. He would work on it there. And so we recreated those scenes.
The room also featured an outside door of its own where the Bunch could slip in for a visit without disturbing Nancy.
The main entrance.
History tells us some of those guys clearly preferred their old cowboy buddy to the domesticated version of Charlie, but the artist was a happily married man. His talent focused, managed, and likely inspired by his true love, Russell was incredibly prolific. He created more than 4,000 works of art, recreating the unspoiled West of cowboys, Indians, and wildlife that he had known firsthand and missed like a long-lost love.
Russell wanted to experience the real West before it was gone, and he did that. And so working as an artist, he really concentrated on painting what he called the West that has passed.
But thanks to Charlie and the guiding love of Nancy, we can still visit that world of buffalo hunts, wagon trains, and the smoke of a .45, and the home and studio where the paintbrush of the cowboy artist brought it all back to life.